is the 8th session in the series, Time for the Nations to Reap. Our focus remains on Portugal because it played a significant role in the slave trade from the 15th to the 19th century. The government has never apologized or taken responsibility, even though it played a leading role in the business. A fair question to ask is, how rich did Portugal get during slavery? This article from World History Encyclopedia is telling us that the Portuguese built an empire from 1420 onwards that was largely composed of trade centers dotted around the coasts of 3 continents. This colonial enterprise was driven by a search for African gold, Asian spices, and Christian kingdoms in the east. The curiosity and expertise of Portuguese mariners like Vasco da Gama resulted in the exploration of new sea routes down the coast of West Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the Indian Ocean to India and beyond. By the time Portuguese Brazil was created, it had truly become the first global intercontinental empire. So it says the age of exploration led to a new, more violent and disruptive world where colonial powers carved up the globe as they jostled to extract precious resources from wherever they might be found and to enslave and transport millions of people for use as free labor. But these folks want to pretend that they pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, ignoring the fact that they profited tremendously from the free labor of others. It says this age of empires, as we might call it, still has consequences today wherever colonial powers once imposed their language, culture, and religion upon indigenous peoples worldwide. We'll begin with this journal article entitled The Profits of the Portuguese-Brazilian Transatlantic Slave Trade. It says, together, Portugal and Brazil were the second biggest players in the transatlantic slave trade. However, we still know little about the profits generated by the slave trade and by the activities carried out by the slaves within the Portuguese Empire, in particular in the Atlantic world. In other words, who were the various groups benefiting from those profits and where was the capital obtained, invested, and or reinvested? So I'll drop down. It says research on the transatlantic slave trade has also sparked an important debate concerning the role of the slave trade, slave-based activities, and slave produce in the process of industrialization and enrichment of the European countries involved both in this business and in the process of empire building, which was also partially based on slave labor. Now let's see how much they were making. It says, according to our estimates for the period 1715 to 1833, Portuguese-Brazilian participation in the transatlantic slave trade generated an estimated gross profit of about 95 million pounds. The bulk of these gains were obtained in the 19th century during the peak period of this trade and in the first half of the 18th century when the differential between purchase prices in West Central Africa and the sale prices in Minas Gerais was at its highest. Now keep in mind that we're talking about millions of dollars in 1715. That was a hefty profit. Now let's look at this table showing the number of enslaved people at various ports of embarkation. And we see that between 1514 and 1525, 924 people were transported, and they came from these locations. They were taking them from Bight of Biafra and Gulf of Guinea, and then they were also taking them from West Central Africa and St. Helena. Now look at how that number jumped to nearly 30,000 people in 1576, between 1576 and 1600. But by 1625, that number went up to more than 73,000 people. That's a lot of people being trafficked. Now it dropped down and then peaked again between 1826 and 1850 to over 1 million, with the highest number of people coming from West Central Africa and St. Helena. Now, I also want to share some excerpts from this journal article entitled Economic Aspects of Slavery and the Triangular Trade in the Early Modern Period. It says slavery has existed since the beginning of human civilization. However, there was a great upsurge in slavery during the early modern period of the Age of Discovery, when it gained enormous popularity and took new forms. The greatest European powers at the time conquered new territories in Central and North America, developing plans how to exploit them in the most profitable way possible. To unlock the economic potential of these territories, colonial countries started organizing a plantation economy by using slave labor. Consequently, colonial countries generated large profits while the international trade began to flourish. So let's read some more of this. It says, as early as in the 17th century, the purchase of slaves became the most important element of trade. Now we need to wrap our minds around that. The purchase of slaves became the most important element of trade, while the entire West African coast transformed into a certain type of a slave trade center. Why West Africa? Why wasn't it all of Africa? This is the point that most people are missing. They went to a specific area. They were looking for a specific group of people. And this just happens to be where the kingdom of Judah was. It says, in fact, to Europeans, trading with African states was only a means for taking slaves, rather than the ultimate goal, which was to ensure a sufficient number of slaves to work on the plantations in colonies. So it says, Europeans used Africa exclusively as a transit port, where they only came to get slaves and transport them to the colonies in the Americas. Slave trade did not pertain, listen, to entire Africa. Rather, it was regional and took place along the Atlantic coast of Africa, also known as the Slave Coast. Now listen carefully to this part. Europeans developed a special process of buying slaves known as slave factories, i.e., trading posts on the West African coast, where Europeans built small armed forts. The forts were intended primarily for defense against other competing trading posts, but also for slave trade itself. Each fort was headed by an agent who was in charge of maintaining good relations with local African tribes and ensuring good trading conditions. Such business operations in factories were extremely expensive and risky, and they also required substantial financial resources for maintaining forts, military defense, and good relations with local rulers. But listen to this. Europeans came to the West African coast to trade at a specific time of the year, either after the harvest or during the dry season. But listen, because this is when African tribes were most often at war. During that period, there was an enormous number of slaves available for purchase, since the defeated tribes were enslaved. How would they know when the African tribes would be at war? It was because the agents that they had there at the forts, they were instigating these tribal wars. They were ensuring that these people would be at war with each other, giving one side the guns, the ammunition, etc., to ensure that they would win and take captives, so that these captives would be ready when the ships came. Do you see how diabolical these people are? Let's keep going. Now let's turn our attention to some information found in this article that was in How Africa Now. It says, check out the top 5 countries that profited from slavery. According to the World Economy, Portugal began its slave trading activities in Africa around 1445. Not too long after Portuguese navigators discovered and settled in the Cape Verde Islands opposite Senegal. There, they were able to buy slaves from African merchants in return for salt, cloth, horses, and trinkets. And if you remember, in the previous sessions, we talked about how these Africans were not selling their own people. They were selling the strangers who were among them. So it says about 175,000 slaves were between 1450 and 1600 shipped to Portugal and its Atlantic islands. Portugal later captured slaves further south in Angola as the slave trade developed. At the end of the 16th and in the 17th century, when Portugal shipped slaves to Brazil and oversaw most of the slave shipments to Spanish America, the slave trade became more profitable. Between 1500 and 1870, out of the 9.4 million slaves shipped to the Americas, about 4.5 million of those were supplied by Portugal, making it Europe's largest trafficker of human beings. The growth of the sugar economy in Portugal's colony of Brazil was thanks to the work of the slaves. So was gold mining, which the Portuguese used to pay for industrialized goods such as textiles and weapons, and to erect regal buildings and monuments. Let's take a quick look at some of those regal buildings and monuments that can be found in Portugal. Now, did you happen to see any monuments of those who built it? No, you didn't. And you won't, because talking about the way they got the wealth is a taboo topic. The memory is too uncomfortable. It's embarrassing because they want the world to believe that they were hardworking people who built a vast empire by the sweat of their brows, not free labor. So let's take a look at this article from The Guardian entitled, Built on the Bodies of Slaves: How Africa Was Erased from the History of the Modern World. So it says, the creation of the modern interconnected world is generally credited to European pioneers, but Africa was the wellspring for almost everything they achieved. I hope you heard that. Africa was the wellspring for almost everything European nations achieved, and African lives were the terrible cost. It says it would be unusual for a story that begins in the wrong place to arrive at the right conclusions. And so it is with the history of how the modern world was made. Traditional accounts have accorded a primacy to Europe's 15th century age of discovery and to the maritime connection it established between West and East. Paired with this historic feat is the momentous, if accidental, discovery of what came to be known as the New World. Other explanations for the emergence of the modern world reside in the ethics and temperament that some associate with Judeo-Christian beliefs, or with the development and spread of the scientific method, or, more chauvinistically still, with Europeans' often professed belief in their unique ingenuity and inventiveness. In the popular imagination, these ideas have become associated with the work ethic, individualism, and entrepreneurial drive that supposedly flowed from the Protestant Reformation in places such as England and Holland. Let's go on. It says, of course, there is no denying the significance of the voyage of mariners such as Vasco da Gama, who reached India via the Indian Ocean in 1498, Ferdinand Magellan, who traveled west to Asia, skirting the southern tip of South America, and Christopher Columbus. It says, although these famous feats of discovery dominate the popular imagination, they obscure the true beginnings of the story of how the globe became permanently stitched together and thus became modern. If we look more closely at the evidence, it will become clear that Africa played a central role in this history. By miscasting the role of Africa, generations have been taught a profoundly misleading story about the origins of modernity. The first impetus for the Age of Discovery was not Europe's yearning for ties with Asia, as so many of us learned in school, but rather its centuries-old desire to forge trading ties with legendarily rich Black societies hidden away in the heart of darkest West Africa. Iberia's most famous sailors cut their teeth not seeking routes to Asia, but rather plying the West African coastline. This is where they perfected techniques of map making and navigation, where Spain and Portugal experimented with improved ship designs, and where Columbus came to understand the Atlantic Ocean winds and currents well enough that he would later reach the western limits of the sea with a confidence that no European had previously had before him. of being able to return home. Let's go on. It says the long thread that leads us to the present began in those 3 decades at the end of the 15th century, when commerce blossomed between Portugal and Africa, sending a newfound prosperity washing over what had previously been a marginal European country. What was Portugal? A marginal European country. But that changed after they got involved in human trafficking. It drove urbanization in Portugal on an unprecedented scale and created new identities that gradually freed many people from feudal ties to the land. One of these novel identities was nationhood, whose origins were bound up in questing for wealth in faraway lands, and soon thereafter in immigration and colonization in the tropics. I'll drop down. It says the fateful engagement between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa produced civilizational transformations in both regions, as well as in the wider world ones that, look back today, produced an exceptionally crisp division between before and after. So this is what Portugal looked like before, but look at what they look like now. Back then, Europeans were mindful of this reality. As late as the 1530s, well after the start of Portugal's more famous spice trade with Asia, Lisbon still recognized Africa as the leading driver of all that was new. João de Barros, a counselor to that country's crown, wrote, listen to what he says, I do not know in this kingdom a yoke of land, toll, tithe, excise, or any other royal tax more reliable than the profits of commerce in Guinea. But as remarkable as Barros's acknowledgment of African vitality was, his omission of slavery as a pillar of the relationship was equally notable. It may have been the first time that the centrality of black bondage was simply passed over in an informed account of modernity in the West. It would not be the last. When Barros wrote, Portugal overwhelmingly dominated Europe's trade in Africans, and slavery was beginning to rival gold as Portugal's most lucrative source of African bounty. By then, it was already on its way to becoming the foundation of a new economic system based on plantation agriculture. Over time, that system would generate far more wealth for Europe than African gold or Asian silks and spices. Now, don't miss what they readily admitted back then about how they got their wealth. These are things they will try to deny today, or even pretend that, oh, it wasn't that significant. So, a leading 18th century British expert on commerce called the rents and revenues of plantation slave labor the fundamental prop and support of his country's prosperity. He described the British Empire as a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power built on an African foundation. So around the same time, an equally prominent French thinker described Europe's plantations worked by African enslaved people as the principal cause of the rapid motion which now agitates the universe. An English author of Robinson Crusoe but also a traitor, Daniel Defoe, a pamphleteer and spy, bested both when he wrote, "No African trade, no Negroes. No Negroes, no sugars, gingers, indigos, no sugar, etc. No islands, no continent, no continent, no trade." So these folks know where their bread and butter came from, and that's why they're still exploiting the continent and its people today. Watch how quickly European nations fall when all of them are kicked out of Africa. They will fall like dominoes because they rely heavily on the resources they steal from the continent. Listen as the article goes on to say, through the development of plantation agriculture and a succession of history-altering commercial crops like tobacco, coffee, cacao, indigo, rice, and above all sugar, Europe's deep and often brutal ties with Africa drove the birth of a truly global capitalistic economy. Slave-grown sugar hastened the coming together of the process we call industrialization. It radically transformed diets, making possible much higher worker productivity. And in doing so, sugar revolutionized European society. Continuing, it says, in sugar's wake, cotton grown by enslaved people in the American South helped launch formal industrialization, along with a second wave of consumerism. Abundant and varied clothing for the masses became a reality for the first time in human history. The scale of the American antebellum cotton boom, which made this possible, was nothing short of astonishing. Why? Free labor, and the people came with the skills. It says the value derived from the trade and ownership of enslaved people in the U.S. alone, as distinct from the cotton and other products they produced, was greater than that of all of the country's factories, railroads, and canals combined. Now forgotten European contests over control of the African bounty partly built the modern world by strengthening fixed national allegiances. Spain and Portugal waged fierce naval battles in West Africa over access to gold. Holland and Portugal, then unified with Spain, fought something little short of a world war in the 17th century in present-day Congo and Angola, vying for control of trade in the richest sources of enslaved people in Africa. On the far side of the Atlantic, Brazil, the biggest producer of slave-grown sugar in the early 17th century, was caught up in this same struggle and repeatedly changed hands. Later in that same century, England fought Spain over control of the Caribbean. So they began fighting with each other to claim rights to the continent and its people. And yet they try to gaslight us by saying that the Civil War was not fought because of slavery. Yeah, right. Openly, this is how they portray the continent and its people. Do you remember when he said this? Couldn't figure out why people from these S-hole countries were coming here. Truth be told, this is a more accurate description of the place where Indo-Europeans came from in the Caucasus Mountains. And this is why they left their homeland to steal the land that belonged to others. If your homeland was so great, what are you doing here? Now, I want you to listen to this excerpt from this article from the College of Charleston because it's really going to show how desperate the Portuguese were to get their hands on the people in West Africa. It says, in the 15th century, Portugal became the first European nation to take significant part in African slave trading. The Portuguese primarily acquired slaves for labor on Atlantic African island plantations and later for plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, though they also sent a small number to Europe. Initially, listen, Portuguese explorers attempted to acquire or steal African labor through direct raids along the coast, but they found that these attacks were costly and often ineffective against West and Central African military strategies. For example, in 1444, Portuguese marauders arrived in Senegal ready to assault and capture Africans using armor, swords, and deep sea vessels. They're desperate. But the Portuguese discovered that the Senegalese outmaneuvered their ships using light, shallow water vessels better suited to the estuaries of the Senegalese coast. So you can see a picture here in the top left. They outsmarted them, you all, because their ships were lighter, the Senegalese, and they could move around a lot easier in the shallow waters. So it says, in addition, the Senegalese fought with poison arrows that slipped through their armor and decimated the Portuguese soldiers. So they tried a different tactic. Listen, subsequently, Portuguese traders generally abandoned direct combat and established commercial relations with West and Central African leaders who agreed to sell slaves taken from various African wars, talking about us. We were the strangers in West Africa at that time. Or domestic trading as well as gold and other commodities in exchange for European and North African goods. It goes on to say over time, the Portuguese developed additional slave trade partnerships with African leaders along the West and Central African coast and claimed a monopoly over these relationships, which initially limited access to the trade for other Western European competitors. Despite Portuguese claims, African leaders enforced their own local laws and customs in negotiating trade relations. Many welcomed additional trade with Europeans from other nations. It says, when Portuguese and later their European competitors found that peaceful commercial relations alone, listen, did not generate enough enslaved Africans to fill the growing demands of the transatlantic slave trade, listen, they formed military alliances with certain African groups against their enemies. So they got them to fight against each other. And they're still doing the same thing today. Even now, they're trying to coerce certain African nations to go against Niger. Let's keep going. It says this encouraged more extensive warfare to produce captives for trading, while European-backed Africans had their own political or economic reasons for fighting with other African enemies. The end result for European traders in these military alliances was greater access to enslaved war captives. Who were they selling? They were not selling their own people. So it says, to a lesser extent, Europeans also pursued African colonization to secure access to slaves and other goods. For example, the Portuguese colonized portions of Angola in 1571 with the help of military alliances from Congo, but were pushed out in 1591 by their former allies. Throughout this early period, African leaders and European competitors ultimately prevented these attempts at African colonization from becoming as extensive as in the Americas. It goes on to say the Portuguese dominated the early transatlantic slave trade on the African coast in the 16th century. As a result, other European nations first gained access to enslaved Africans through privateering during wars with the Portuguese rather than through direct trade. When English, Dutch, or French privateers captured Portuguese ships during the Atlantic maritime conflicts, they often found enslaved Africans on these ships, as well as Atlantic trade goods, and they sent these captives to work in their own colonies. All right, so this history article talks about how Portugal's seafaring expertise launched the age of exploration. And I talked about the age of exploration, where they basically just went into other countries, and according to them, they had the religious right and the authority of the king to just go in and take these lands if they were not Christian nations. And again, at that time, a Christian nation meant a white European or white Protestant. So it says, perched on the southwestern part of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal turned to the boundless Atlantic Ocean as its only outlet to the wider world. As early as 1341, Portuguese sailors had made their first forays into the tempting waters that lay beyond their shores, exploring the Canary Islands off the northwestern coast of Africa. Rival Spain would later end up conquering the Canaries, but the Portuguese had already seized the global advantage when it came to shipbuilding, navigation, and map making. Not long after the 15th century dawned, Portugal, under the ambitious King John I, turned its sights toward Morocco, the Muslim stronghold seen as the gateway to the gold, spices, and other untold riches in Africa and beyond. So it's saying in the 15th century, Portugal was a small kingdom with a population of approximately 1 million, and they launched the era of maritime exploration that would transform the world. So listen to this. It says, in the early 16th century, Portugal was the most prosperous nation in the world, thanks to its feats of navigation, exploration, and conquest. From India, its ships pushed further east, reaching the Spice Islands, this is in Indonesia, in 1512, and China in 1514. Continuing, it says, in 1482, Portuguese traders built Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana on the west coast of Africa. A fortified trading post, it had mounted cannons facing out to sea, not inland toward continental Africa. The Portuguese had greater fear of a naval attack from other Europeans than of a land attack from Africans. Portuguese traders soon began to settle around the fort and establish the town of Elmina. So it says, although the Portuguese originally used the fort primarily for trading gold, by the 16th century, They had shifted their focus. The dungeon of the fort now served as a holding pen for African slaves from the interior of the continent, while on the upper floors, Portuguese traders ate, slept, and prayed in a chapel. Slaves lived in the dungeon for weeks or months until ships arrived to transport them to Europe or the Americas. For them, the dungeon of Elmina was their last sight of their home country. Now let's wrap things up with passages from Micah 4. We'll read verses 6 through 10. It says, "In that day, says the Most High, I will assemble the lame." A lame person is someone who's unable to walk without difficulty as a result of an injury. He says, "I will gather the outcast and those whom I have afflicted." So why are they lame? They're lame because they were afflicted. But notice that he says, he will make the lame a remnant. I will make the lame a remnant. The ones he afflicted, they become a nation. It does not say they become the church. Pause and think on that. The outcast will be a strong nation. An outcast is someone who is rejected or cast out, as from their home or from society, or in some way they are excluded and looked down upon. He says they will become a strong nation. And then he says, I will rule over them. Where? In Mount Zion. From now on, even forever. This is confirming that this is a last day prophecy. It says, "And you, O tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come. Even the former dominion shall come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem." This is telling us that the kingdom will be restored, that the former dominion shall come, it says, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem. So he's speaking of Yasharel, speaking of his chosen people. What else does he say? He begins asking questions. Why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in your midst? Has your counselor perished? Then he says, "For pangs have seized you like a woman in labor. Be in pain and labor to bring forth." So these pangs or these pains are like the pains of childbirth. It says these pangs have seized you like a woman in labor. Then it says be in pain. Why? Because they're bringing something forth. It says, "O daughter of Zion, like a woman in birth pangs." Then it says, "For now you shall go forth from the city. You shall dwell in the field, and to Babylon you shall go." They're going into captivity. But notice that he says they will go forth from the city and they go to Babylon. So for those who keep sending me messages that this is the promised land, it's interesting that this says they are taken out of the land and taken to Babylon. Is this Babylon and the promised land? Just asking. So it says, "From there you shall be delivered." From where? From Babylon. He will redeem us from Babylon and from the hand of our enemies. Let's go on. Let's continue with verses 11 through 13. "Now also many nations have gathered against you." We've had many nations come against us, but they fail to understand that this is not our permanent condition. It may seem like it. It seemed that way to the Egyptians too. But our enemies will watch as a nation is born in one day. Let's keep reading. Let's see what these nations are saying. Let her be defiled, and let our eye look upon Zion. But listen to what he says. They do not know the thoughts of the Most High, nor do they understand his counsel. For he will gather them like sheaves to the threshing floor. They're saying these things because they are ignorant of what it means to be in covenant with the Most High. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron, and I will make your hooves bronze. You shall beat in pieces many peoples. I will consecrate their gain to the Most High, and their substance to the Most High of the whole earth. This is talking about restoration. The lame will be healed and become a strong nation. The nations that gathered against us got the upper hand when we were weak. They took our stuff, not knowing that our affliction would be temporary. Everything that was lost is coming back, and then some. All of the riches they stole will be returned, and they will be beaten into pieces. Portugal led the way in this European slave trade and got filthy rich as a result. And in the next session, I'm going to talk about the other ways they enriched themselves at our expense. The trafficking of our people wasn't the only way, but it's going to be restored to us. And we know that Abba's word will not return unto him void. In these verses, we see restoration and judgment, because it is time for the nations to reap. So we will end it there for this session. Be sure to hit the like, share it, and also remember to connect with us on the Gates of Huldah extended channel. The link will be in the description. Join me next time. Be blessed, family.